Okay, so now we're going to continue on with our camera fundamentals part two and speak about manual mode and some best practices for shooting in manual mode, as well as kind of what you need to do to make sure that your exposures turn out correctly. Okay, so manual mode is normally designated on the camera as the M mode, and this mode is going to affect how the camera selects the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO combination, right, to make an exposure. In manual mode, you're going to be choosing all of those things yourself, right? Thus, the idea of manual and the opposite of automatic. So, some tips. One is in manual mode, you select all of these things yourself, as we just said, and you want to adjust the exposure indicator to the center or 0 point of the exposure scale by changing any of those three, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So here we have, for example, our exposure scale. Now you will see this you'll see this either when you look through your viewfinder or some form of this. It's kind of like a number line going from into the negative for the underexposure over into the positive for the overexposure. Um, and then right in the middle is the 0 point, and you want to move your exposure indicator, which is this like little dash, vertical dash below. You want to make sure it's going to be right in the middle, not far in either direction. Okay, now you are going to come into contact with that in a couple different places. I spoke about the viewfinder mode, but then you also may see this on the back of the camera, or sometimes you'll have a display on top of the camera that you can see this exposure scale. And here you can see we have a little bit in this picture, we've got the exposure indicator showing us that we're about 1/3 of a stop overexposed, okay, which is not a whole lot, but it's just a little bit, just so we know. It's got all those other controls like the ISO, the aperture setting, and the shutter speed setting all set up right there for us. So um, if the exposure indicator is in the negative zone, like on this left, it will be underexposed or too dark. And the further you get, the darker it's going to get, right? And these numbers relate to stops of exposure. Okay, if it's in the positive zone over here, then it will be overexposed or too bright. Here's another version over here on the left of what an info screen on the back of your camera may look like when you're in the shooting mode. So this is this little scale again here. Sometimes this one goes to +3 and -3. This is a representation of what you might see in the viewfinder when you look. You won't see all three of these rows. You'll just see one of these at a time. Again, this is showing your ISO speed in this camera, 200. Over here, it's showing you the 125 as your shutter speed first, and the second number is going to be your f-stop number. So, and in this situation, we have our exposure scale right in the middle, and our exposure indicator is perfectly aligned in the center, meaning at 1/25 of a second at f16 and ISO 200, we should be taking a photograph that's correctly exposed. Right below it in the second row, we see that we're over on the right side, meaning that we would be overexposing this particular scene by 1 stop, according to the camera's light meter. And then below, we have sort of the reverse situation where we've now closed down the aperture setting down to f22, which is 1 stop less light than f16. And so we're down into the -1 stop exposure on the exposure scale. So, of course, that's what the camera is calculating based on the correct exposure. But in this case, when you're in manual mode, you wouldn't use exposure compensation button. You would just adjust the camera, the ISO, the aperture setting, or the shutter speed to align and expose correctly. So one other thing I'd like to discuss is just one or so simple settings on your camera to add to your understanding of how your camera works. And I wanted to talk for a moment about shutter release modes. So shutter release modes affect how many pictures are taken when you press the shutter button all the way down. So um, Canon calls these drive modes, and they're usually icons on the back of your camera and your info settings um, that will change based on what type of drive mode or shutter release mode you're in. Here we can see some choices. The single rectangle is a single picture will be taken when after you do your focus lock and then you press your shutter button all the way down. It's just going to take one picture even if you continue to hold that shutter button down. The high speed continuous or the low speed continuous, some cameras might have both of these choices. Some may just have one. You see several different, the icon, which looks like several rectangles stacked on top of each other. And that represents that when you hold down that shutter button, it's just going to continue to take pictures as fast as you can. And here we have the remote, like a self-timer mode with a remote. And this represents for this camera that it would be a remote for 10 seconds. It would take 10 seconds before the camera would actually take the picture. And here we have the same idea, but just it would take a picture after 2 seconds. So in a Nikon, this is a Nikon screen. They call them it calls it the release mode. I just went over what continuous and self versus the continuous mode means. So I'll just go down here to self timer and just say, the self timers are good, obviously, for when you want to take a picture with your family and the camera's on a tripod or some stable position and you want to run back and be in the frame as well. It gives you some time to do that. The idea of a shorter period of time or another reason why you might want to use that self-timer option is when you're taking a really long exposure on a tripod and you want to make sure that when you're handling the camera and pushing down the button, that in and of itself is not shaking the camera around and blurring your exposure because of camera blur while the camera is exposing. So this is a way of kind of like you push the button and then the camera can not be still again before it actually opens the shutter and takes the picture. And that's it. So thanks again for completing and moving through all the camera fundamentals 2 for this week. And I will be back for some more soon.